And we're back on Consumer Choice Radio, coming to you on Saga 960 AM and the Big Talker FM. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our next guest. He is the Member of Parliament for Carleton. He served as both the Minister of Democratic Reform and Minister of Employment and Social Development under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and is currently the critic for Jobs and Industry. Welcome to Consumer Choice Radio, Pierre Poilievre.
Good to be with you.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. You've been hammering away at some pretty key consumer topics, whether it be plastic policy or inflation and all sorts of good stuffs. But I figured we start on plastics, because recently I saw a rather cheeky video of you asking someone testifying or providing comment to committee what they would do or how the meeting would continue if you actually banned those plastic headsets like the one you're wearing right now. And so what's your take on what the government's doing, the SEPA toxic designation, the ban of certain products? Is this the right way to go, or is there a better way for us to deal with plastic waste?
No and yes. No, it's not the right way to go, and yes, there's a better way. Quick recap, though, of that committee engagement. We were having hearings on the green recovery at industry committee, and an environmental activist came on and said she wanted to ban plastic products. Well, I happen to know what kind of headset she was wearing, because all members, all witnesses and MPs are issued the very same headset. They're mailed to their houses so that they can speak clearly enough for the French English translators to hear them. And I know this headset, which I'm wearing now and she was wearing then, is made almost exclusively of plastic, with some exceptions, but it could not exist without plastic, and therefore she could not be giving the very testimony to ban plastic that she was giving through that headset if her ban was in place. Now, it seems like a sort of a cheeky gotcha moment, but it's actually illustrative of a larger truth. And that is that while plastics, for reasons I don't fully understand, have a bad reputation, they are absolutely essential for our way of life. In the last year of the COVID pandemic, we have needed plastics more than ever. We're all just getting vaccinated. Well, the needles that the vials that contain our, not the vials, but the tubes that contain the original vaccine are made of plastic. So too are those compression buttons made of plastic. We're all having those pictures of tape, of the Band-Aid or tape over our entry point, and the tape and the Band-Aids require plastic. So you've got EpiPens that require plastic. There are plastic in certain types of face masks, and I could go on and on and on. In other words, we could not have got through the pandemic without plastic. And the idea that we would drive plastic production out of Canada means that if there were ever another pandemic, we would be even more dependent on the rest of the world to supply us with essentials. Plastics are durable, they're hygienic, they're moldable, and they're one of the most recyclable things on planet Earth, because they can simply be melted down and remolded into something different. Small additions and subtractions of chemical compounds can alter their chemistry and make a new product. So as the market demands go from one thing to another, you can take the same chemistry and convert it into something different for another use. That is not true of almost all other products. So what we should be doing is encouraging Canada to become a super hub of plastic recycling. And you can basically reuse those molecules again and again and again and again for literally generations. So our great grandkids are still using the same plastic molecules that we had manufactured in this generation. That is something you can't say about almost any other product. So in other words, let's become a plastic recycling superpower, instead of just driving production to other places and paying them to import their goods.
So you're listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We're speaking with Canadian Member of Parliament Pierre Poilievre. Pleasure to talk to you. And one of the most entertaining follows on social media in terms of Anglosphere politicians, I think, who speak for a lot of us who can't be in those chambers or rooms or locked in your offices, whatever it might be. I have a question here about inflation. You put out a
Yes.
video not long ago about the inflation tax. I think it's something that many consumers don't necessarily understand. It's very high-winded. It's up in the clouds. Could you explain a bit what you mean by inflation tax and how you think the current government is leading Canadians astray on that?
Well, the inflation tax is one of the oldest tricks in the book for emperors, kings, dictators, prime ministers, and presidents. I mean, nobody likes taxes, and therefore leaders don't like to be caught raising them. But by contrast, leaders love to spend other people's money. So in the olden days, what kings and emperors used to do is just create more cash in order to spend it. So, for example, I think of Henry VIII. He is known for beheading his subjects, but he was also known for clipping his coins. And most famously, he became known as Old Copper Nose, and that was because he was trying to make more and more British pounds, and a British pound at that time was actually a pound of silver. But he ran out of silver because he was making so many British pounds. So what did he do? He melted them down and he reminted them entirely full of copper with a tiny layer of silver on the outside to trick his subjects into thinking that they were still getting a silver pound. But what would happen is his face was on the coin and it faced outward rather than in a profile view. And what comes out the most, what protrudes the most? His nose. And so his nose would rub against the inside of people's pockets and money sacks, and the rest of his face would remain silver, but his nose would be exposed as copper. So you'd have the silver face and a red copper nose. The silver face was like the mask that a bank robber would wear when he's stealing from a bank. Well, this was the mask, the silver mask that a king was wearing when he was robbing his people. And of course, what happened is that the silver content went down by about 87%, and prices in British pounds went up by about 87%, right? Because you had more coins chasing fewer goods. Well, the same thing happened in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s when they printed cash. You needed a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. You needed to order all your beer when you first got to the bar because by the end of the night, beer prices would be more expensive. And in more modern sense, in the 1970s, we saw Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Richard Nixon and others print money, and they caused massive inflation, which led to higher interest rates. Right now, we are experiencing 10-year highs in overall inflation, the biggest housing price increases in Canadian history. And that has coincided with the central bank increasing the money supply in Canada by $350 billion. That is a 20% increase, the biggest increase since 1974. It began in March 2020 and continues right through to the present. And they've done it by buying up government debt in order to allow Trudeau to borrow money that he never would have been able to get on normal lending markets because no one would lend him that much money. And so the increase in the money supply has driven up asset prices and is beginning to drive up CPI consumer prices as well. The result, of course, is a massive wealth transfer from the working class wage earner to the wealthy capitalist asset holder. If you own assets and big valuable assets, well, you've gotten a lot richer because those assets have inflated in price. But if you just live off your wages, well, your wages are shrinking in real inflation adjusted value. So you've had a pay cut. So what the inflation tax does, in addition to raising cash for the government, is it inflates the price of the things the rich own and that the poor must buy.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, as I've been following this, the conversation has shifted. It was first, inflation isn't happening. Then it
Right.
was, inflation is just transitory, guys. It's
Yeah.
just transitory. It's going to come and it's going to go. And now we're starting to see like the realization of, oh, it's here, and it's gonna be maintained and it's gonna be reasonable, and we're not gonna have to raise rates that bad. It's not gonna be that bad. So it's just one of those things where we're kind of slowly seeing this play out in real time, as some of us, with yourself included, have kind of forecasted. Another issue that is, it's related to the inflation discussion, but it's one of the ones that I haven't seen many really carry the banner for, is housing prices. I mean, I crunched some numbers today. I'm in the Greater Toronto area, and a house down the street from me, or around the corner, um, from where we rent, essentially outperformed the top performing hedge fund from 2018 until today. So if you had money and you put it down as a down payment and you gave it to the most powerful hedge fund in the world, you'd be poorer today with your money with that hedge fund than you would be otherwise if you had been able to buy that house. And for me, as someone who would maybe one day like to own a house, it just feels so um, discomforting, because there's just no way, unless your wages skyrocket, there's no way to really get there. And so I wanted to pick your brain on what the federal government can do to help curb this issue of kind of runaway housing prices, and that disparity and that gap between those who can afford and those who will probably never be able to afford a house.
Well, it's not what the government can do, it's what the government must stop doing. The government is not failing to respond to rising housing prices. It is causing rising housing prices. The culprit is money printing. That's the main federal culprit. And I can prove it by looking at the data and the charts. So this is what's interesting. In March and April of 2020, when COVID hit, housing prices went down, and they were on a sharp downward trajectory. The major housing insurer in Canada, CMHC, predicted that the housing prices would drop 10 to 14%. And why wouldn't they? If the GDP the GDP dropped by 5.5%, we lost $120 billion of economic activity in 2020. You would expect that the result would be lower housing prices. People have less wages with which to buy houses. There's higher unemployment, which means fewer people could qualify for a mortgage in the first place. You would just assume that housing prices would drop. But the government started printing money. And it was only after that printed money hit the market that prices reversed and started going back up. So you have March and April prices drop. All the central bank money pours in, and the prices turn around and start going back up. And just for some symmetry here, from April 2020 to April 2021, mortgage lending went up by 41% and housing prices went up by 42%. So that can't be a coincidence. Now, why did mortgage lending go up by 42%? Well, it's because they were printing money, and the money goes straight into the financial system. And right now, because mortgages are insured by the government, it's the zero risk place for banks to lend out. If you're a banker and you have to choose between lending to to someone to buy $1 million home they can't afford, but which is backed up by government insurance, or to lend to a small business that would create jobs and long-term productivity, there's no debate about it. You'd lend the money to the homeowner, because even if he defaults, the government through CMHC is going to back you up.
Yeah, you don't get left holding the bag.
You've got a zero risk rate of return. And what is effectively happening with CMHC, which is the second part of this, frankly, the scam, is that the homeowner gets the premium, the bank gets the profit, and the taxpayer gets the risk. The banks are the only entity in the world that I'm aware of that gets to have insurance with no deductible and no premium. The premium is paid by the home buyer, and the entire loss is paid by the taxpayer with no deductible for the insured party, which is the banks. So this is like a perfect system, and the Europeans don't have this. The Americans are getting away from it because it's a massive $1 trillion moral hazard. Whenever you separate risk and reward, then you get massive risk taking. right? Because people say, I don't have the risk, I
Mhm.
just get the profit. So then imagine if I said to you, I'm going to insure all your losses on the stock market. Well, you just dump everything into the riskiest stocks possible because you might profit, and if you lose everything, it's on me, right? So that's essentially what we have in our housing system right now. And you combine the fact that we're printing money, the moral hazard of protecting financial institutions from loss. And what do you get? Massive, unsustainable mortgage lending that will result in a debt crisis down the road.
Yep. Yeah. Collectivizing private losses, which is about as bad as it gets in terms of government policy.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio. It's been a pleasure. We'll have you on again shortly.
Great to be with you, David.